So all week we've been looking at what happens when we take a raw chicken egg and we place it in different liquids. The first liquid that we placed it in was vinegar, and that, if you recall, dissolved the outer shell. And it left us with this flexible membrane just inside of the shell. We then placed it in a number of other liquids in series and watched what happened. And the egg swelled in some liquids, got bigger, and it shrank in others. So we need to explore why this happened. To do that, we need to look at membrane transport, which is basically how cells get materials across the cell membrane and how cells keep other materials outside of the cell. So it's important to remember that cell membranes are selectively permeable. And that means they act like a screen by letting some chemicals or molecules through and stopping others. So you can kind of think of it like the door of a cell. It's an opening through which some things can pass in and out. So we need to look at the structure of the cell membrane because that will help tell us how it functions to do that. So here's our cell membrane, very simplified, and you have molecules here that are made up of this circular head and then these long zigzag tails. And it's oriented so that two molecules are kind of facing one another with the tails directed towards one another. So the membrane really stops things or keeps some things out because of how it's built. The inside of the membrane is what we call hydrophobic. So you know that the prefix hydro means water, and phobic or phobia means fear. So it hates water or is repelled by water. And that's this area in here where these long tails are hanging next to one another. The outside of the membrane, on either side here, is hydrophilic. So it likes water. And this is where these large oval-shaped heads are located on either side. So what? Why is this important? Well, the water-loving and water-hating parts of the membrane tend to keep some things out or away from the membrane. Important to remember that that membrane is selectively permeable. It does have holes, and some things do get through, and we need to look at the ways that this happens. So the first category that we're going to look at in today's broadcast is passive transport. And passive transport, you can probably tell from the word passive, it means that there's no work that's required to be done by the cell to make this happen. In passive transport, you have random movement of particles, and they go from a greater concentration to a lesser concentration. So passive transport requires no extra energy input other than just the molecular motion of atoms and molecules. And there are three different types that we'll explore today. So diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. First, diffusion. You have here on the bottom three different solutions, three different containers. And in this first container, you have a solute and a solvent. So the solute molecules are in red here, and the solvent molecules are the blue dots throughout the whole container. Now, if you have solute that's concentrated on one side of this container, just through the natural action of molecules and atoms as they vibrate and move around in that solution, you will eventually get those solute molecules spreading out so that they are equally distributed throughout that solution. They reach an equilibrium. In a membrane, a molecule will slide through and reach equilibrium just as it did in these three containers. only if it will fit through the membrane. So it has to be able to pass through in order to reach this kind of equilibrium that we see on the right-hand container. So here's an example of diffusion happening. And you have red and blue particles on the left here. The red represents sugar, rather large molecules, and the blue represents water. Now, for our purposes in this illustration, you have a dashed line down the center of this container, and that's a permeable membrane. So both sugar and water can cross through that membrane. In this illustration, the red particles and the blue particles are diffusing. They're going across that membrane. And they're going to continually move until they reach an equilibrium kind of situation, where there's approximately the same number of molecules on either side of that membrane. There's another kind of passive transport called facilitated diffusion. And it's the same kind of concept, does not require additional energy input, but it uses proteins. So here you see this great big purple structure sitting in the middle of the cell membrane, and that's a protein that basically works like a channel. So in this instance, water or sometimes other kinds of molecules, they can pass right through this channel and pass through the cell membrane in that manner without requiring any kind of extra energy input. So you can think of it like a tunnel through the cell membrane that molecules pass through. So it requires a protein, but it doesn't require any energy input. And this is typically the case for molecules that are too big to get through the membrane. They have to use proteins. Remember, no extra energy input is required. Lastly, osmosis is a special type of facilitated diffusion, but it's the diffusion only of water. So in this animation, you have water molecules in blue, and you have sugar molecules in green. But now our membrane here in the center is selectively permeable. And in this case, it means that only water can pass through. The sugar molecules are too big to pass. So what happens is that you start with a high concentration of water molecules on the left side, and through diffusion, those water molecules are going to pass over to the right side of the container so that there's an equilibrium reached. So osmosis is diffusion, but it's a special type of diffusion, a diffusion only of water. To review then, the three types of passive transport do not require additional energy input, and they move particles from a greater to a lesser concentration. But there are times that our cells need to concentrate a chemical on one side of a membrane. And in order to do that, we need to look at a different mechanism. So our next video will be on active transport. And those are the ways that cells move materials across a membrane using energy in order to concentrate chemicals and increase the concentration on one side or another of the membrane.